At her wedding, my daughter-in-law asked me not to bring any food. She said my dishes were too cheap and not suitable for the crowd. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't even attend. A week later, I rented a hall in the same hotel. I invited everyone she had been so desperate to impress, and on every table stood only my dishes. No labels, no prices, no names. One man pulled out a business card and asked who the chef was. I reached out my hand, and he handed me a gold-embossed card. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Delaney, and I was 68 years old the year everything changed. I lived in northern Ohio, in a town that never made headlines, and I was fine with that. My world was measured in seasons, harvests, and the sound of an oven ticking as it cooled. I was a widow of 16 years, a mother to one son, and a grandmother to two lively boys I rarely saw anymore. I didn't hold a degree, and I didn't own a restaurant, but for nearly 50 years, I had fed more people than I could count. Cooking was not just something I did, it was who I was. My mother taught me how to season beans without overpowering their earthiness. My grandmother showed me how to stretch a pot of stew to feed 12, even when we only had enough for 6. I inherited more than recipes from them. I inherited purpose. My hands learned to measure without cups, to sense doneness by smell, to stir counterclockwise for soups and clockwise for bread dough, because that's just how it had always been. I never advertised what I did. There was no chalkboard sign outside my front porch, no QR code, no Instagram page with artfully plated meals. But people came. They always did. When the local church needed pies for a fundraiser, they asked for mine. When a neighbor's mother passed away, I sent over meatloaf and creamed corn without waiting to be asked. When a young couple got married down the street, they served my cornbread alongside their catered salmon. I didn't take money for most of it. Sometimes I got a jar of homemade pickles in return. Sometimes a bouquet of daisies from someone's garden. Sometimes just a thank you note with a smudge of sauce in the corner. That was enough. I lived in the same pale yellow house for over 40 years. The wallpaper in the kitchen had started to peel, and one cabinet door didn't close all the way, but I didn't mind. The table was scratched, the tile was cracked near the sink, but it was my space. My kitchen faced east, so the morning sun always poured in bright and unforgiving. It lit up every speck of flour on the counter, every crumb on the floor, every wrinkle in the curtains. I liked that kind of honesty. Most mornings, I woke up before the birds. I boiled water for tea and looked out the window to check if the squirrels had gotten into my herbs again. I didn't rush. There was no need to. The day started when I opened my recipe journal, the one I'd kept since I was 17. It wasn't fancy. Just a leather-bound notebook with flour-dusted pages and dog-eared corners. The ink had faded in places, and there were splashes of oil and smudges of cinnamon. But every stain told a story. Each recipe had its place. Mama's biscuits came after Sunday apple compote and before Aunt Jean's molasses bread. There were notes in the margins, adjustments I had made over the years. Less sugar, Eli prefers tart, or add rosemary if it's for Pastor Jim. My handwriting changed over time, from young and hopeful to loopy and firm. The journal aged with me, and I couldn't imagine cooking without it. I didn't have a business license, and I didn't belong to any culinary association. I wasn't looking to impress. I just wanted people to feel full, to feel seen. That was something my food always did. It made space for people to breathe. Over the years, I cooked for weddings, funerals, school bake sales, and church potlucks. There was a rhythm to it, grief and joy, all served on paper plates or old china. I remembered the names of children who once licked frosting off my beaters, now grown with kids of their own. Sometimes they'd stop by just to say hi. Sometimes they'd ask if I still made that lemon cake with the glaze that stuck to your fingers. I didn't call myself a chef. That felt too cold, too precise. I was a cook, a kitchen woman, a feeder of people, and in a world that moved too fast and forgot too much, I held on to the slow rituals that stitched one life to another. But all of that, the quiet pride, the unspoken place I held in my community, meant nothing to people who didn't grow up around it. People like my son's fiancée, who came from a different kind of world. She talked about presentation and branding and curated experiences. She liked things polished and edited, optimized for social media. I made mashed potatoes with the skins on. I served chicken that sometimes had a crispier edge than expected. And I believed in seconds. Her world had no space for seconds. Still, I didn't judge her. I understood that we came from different cloth. She preferred things that sparkled. I preferred things that lasted. I didn't need a seat at her table. I had my own. I had built it plank by plank, one recipe at a time, and it had fed generations. In the quiet of my home, with the smell of rosemary and onions in the air, I felt rooted. I didn't know then that all of that, the legacy, the comfort, the slow-stitched years, would soon be dismissed with one careless sentence. But for now, I stirred the pot, preheated the oven, and kept moving. Because that's what you do when the kitchen is your heart. You keep feeding, even when they forget the taste of your hands. The wedding was approaching, and everything seemed to move with a kind of nervous urgency. There were color swatches taped to the fridge, appointment reminders buzzing on my phone, and packages arriving at the house almost daily, boxes filled with table runners, personalized favors, glass vases, and other fragile symbols of a perfect day. My son and his fiancée were planning what they called a modern celebration, a curated experience that would reflect their lifestyle, their aesthetic, their love. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I tried to stay out of the way. I was given tasks, small ones: assemble invitation envelopes, help steam napkins, measure the backyard so they could decide if it could handle overflow guests. I did everything I was asked, but I noticed that the more I helped, the more invisible I became. No one asked for my thoughts on anything that mattered. Not on the ceremony, not on the music, and certainly not on the food. Still, I hoped. I hoped that maybe they would want a little bit of what I had to offer. A side dish, a dessert, something homemade and familiar. I imagined myself making trays of deviled eggs, or peach cobbler, or my famous baked macaroni and cheese. But days passed, and no one mentioned food in relation to me. The catering had already been booked, a company from 2 counties over that specialized in elevated comfort cuisine. I wasn't sure what that meant either, but I smiled when they said it, pretending to understand. Then, one afternoon, I received an email, not a call, not a visit, an email titled Wedding Food Guidelines. It was short and crisp. It listed the times the kitchen would be occupied by the catering team, which containers were allowed for outside food, none, and a highlighted note at the end: please refrain from bringing personal food items to the venue. We want a clean, unified aesthetic. I read it twice. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure if I should respond. I didn't. Instead, I closed the laptop and stood by the window for a long while. Outside, the magnolia tree was blooming early. I had planted it when my son turned 10. It had grown tall and stubborn, stretching toward the sun without asking for permission. I admired that. Over the next few days, the message echoed in my head: clean, unified aesthetic. As if food could be a flaw, as if something warm and messy and made with love could ruin a picture. I started to notice all the little decisions that had been made without me. The bridal shower had been hosted by her family. The menu was catered sushi and mimosas. I wasn't asked to bring anything, not even napkins. I attended the cake tasting as a guest, not a contributor. I watched them sample lavender sponge with lemon mousse and white chocolate ganache. They discussed textures and presentation. I sat quietly and wondered what was wrong with plain butter cake and cream cheese frosting. What was wrong with comfort? What was wrong with something that didn't need a caption? In the days leading up to the wedding, I felt myself shrinking, not from shame, but from exclusion. I was becoming a spectator in a story that should have belonged to me, too. Every mother dreams of her child's wedding, of standing beside them, helping them step into a new chapter. But I wasn't standing anywhere. I was off to the side, holding my hand still so I wouldn't drop the illusion that everything was fine. The dress I bought for the wedding was a soft shade of blue. I had worn it to church once, and it made me feel elegant without drawing too much attention. I laid it on the bed the night before, smoothed out the fabric with my palms, and wondered if it would blend in. If I would blend in. On the morning of the rehearsal dinner, I arrived early to help set up. The tables were already covered in white linens, and the centerpieces had been placed, glass bowls with floating candles and tiny roses in blush tones. Everything looked like a page torn from a bridal magazine. I stood in the corner and watched as the florist arranged the last of the bouquets and the caterers began unloading trays from their van. I recognized one of the waiters. He had served at a local fundraiser the year before, where I had donated 5 pies for the dessert table. He smiled at me, maybe out of habit, maybe out of recognition. I smiled back but said nothing. There was no space for me here, not in the menu, not in the planning, not in the performance. That evening, during dinner, I overheard a conversation at the far end of the table. A guest complimented the hors d'oeuvres, and the bride responded with a laugh, saying, "We wanted to avoid anything that felt too homemade. It's a wedding, not a potluck." My fork stopped midair. My son didn't say a word. He just kept eating. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I swallowed it. I pressed my napkin into my lap and focused on cutting my chicken. Each bite tasted like cardboard. There was no warmth, no story, no soul. It was food meant to impress, not to nourish. I looked around the room, at the candles and perfect lighting, at the guests snapping photos of their plates. No one was eating with joy. They were documenting, not dining. When I returned home that night, I sat at the kitchen table in silence. The house was still, the air cool. I opened the fridge and took out a slice of lemon pound cake I had made a few days prior. I ate it slowly, letting the sugar and zest remind me of something real, something that mattered. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. But I knew, without question, that something inside me had shifted. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg to be seen. I had my own kind of stage, my own kind of audience. I just hadn't set the table yet. The morning of the wedding arrived quietly. There was no buzzing in my chest, no flutter of excitement like I had once imagined I'd feel on the day my only son got married. The house was still, and I moved through it slowly, making my tea with steady hands. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, like it couldn't quite decide if it should rain or not. The weather mirrored something inside me, unsettled, waiting, but already resigned. I dressed carefully. The same soft blue dress I had laid out days ago, paired with my mother's pearl earrings and low-heeled shoes that didn't hurt my feet. My hands worked methodically, fastening the clasp, smoothing the fabric, brushing my hair back from my face. I applied a touch of powder, a swipe of lipstick, not for attention, but for dignity. A part of me felt like I was preparing for a role I didn't audition for, a role that had been written for someone else entirely. When I arrived at the venue, the parking lot was already full. Guests were spilling out of cars, laughing, adjusting dresses, corralling children. Everything moved with a frantic, performative energy. I stepped out of my car and felt instantly out of place. No one noticed me. I wasn't announced. I wasn't welcomed with hugs or escorted inside. I was just another body in the stream of motion, easily bypassed. The wedding planner, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard, greeted people by name and guided them to their spots. When she saw me, she hesitated for a split second before offering a tight smile and pointing toward the far end of the ceremony space. "Family seating is over there," she said, then turned away before I could say anything. I walked to where she had pointed and found a row of chairs near the back, close to the pathway, partially obstructed by one of the floral arches. My name wasn't on a card, no sign of special consideration. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. Around me, guests chatted and took pictures. The air was thick with perfume and nervous excitement. I watched as the groom's side of the family filled in the rows ahead of me. Cousins, aunts, people I hadn't seen in years. No one made room. No one gestured for me to move closer. It was as if I didn't belong to anyone. The ceremony began. Music swelled. The bride appeared at the top of the aisle in a dress that shimmered in the late morning light. She looked radiant, the picture of curated elegance. My son stood at the altar, his face serious, his shoulders squared. I watched him closely, waiting for a glance, a nod, something that said, "I see you." But his eyes never met mine. He looked everywhere but in my direction. Vows were exchanged, rings placed, applause followed, and still I sat in the back, hands still folded, my throat tight. I clapped politely. I smiled when others looked. I played the part of the proud mother, even as I felt the hollow space where that pride should have lived. The reception was held in a large hall attached to the venue. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, soft jazz humming from the speakers. I entered alone, scanning for a place to sit. A staff member approached and pointed to a small table near the exit doors. 4 chairs, one already occupied by an elderly guest I didn't know. It was the table where you put guests you don't know how to place. Too old to sit with the young, too distant to be at the center. I thanked her and sat down. Dinner was served in courses. First a salad, arranged with precision on oversized plates. Then a soup, chilled, pale, garnished with edible flowers. Finally, the main course, a protein I didn't recognize, paired with a smear of something green and unidentifiable. Each dish arrived looking like art and tasting like absence. I ate slowly, mostly to fill time. Across the room, I saw the bride's family clink glasses and pose for pictures. Her parents were at the center of everything, smiling, laughing, giving speeches. I thought of all the nights I had rocked my son to sleep, of the scraped knees I had kissed, of the homemade lunches, the bedtime stories, the college tuition paid in full. And now I sat in a corner, unacknowledged, irrelevant. I wasn't jealous. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was smaller, quieter. I felt erased. After dinner, the toasts began. Friends spoke. The maid of honor recited a poem. The groom's best friend made everyone laugh with stories of high school mischief. My name was never mentioned. There was no speech from the groom's mother, no thank you, no moment. I watched as the cake was rolled out, an elaborate, multi-tiered thing decorated in gold and blush roses. People gathered to admire it, to take photos. I stayed seated. I had made a dozen wedding cakes in my life. This one, though beautiful, held no meaning for me. It was perfect and cold and not mine. Later, as the music began and the lights dimmed, guests took to the dance floor. I stood and walked outside. The air had cooled. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and found a bench near the garden. From there, I could still hear the music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, but it all felt far away. I sat in the dark, under the soft glow of fairy lights, and let the night pass through me. I didn't cry. I didn't sulk. I simply accepted what the day had revealed. I wasn't needed at this wedding. Not really. I had been included by obligation, not by love. And that realization, while quiet, cut deeper than I expected. When I finally stood and walked back to my car, no one noticed I had left. No one called out. The party went on, as parties do, indifferent to the absence of one old woman. But something inside me was no longer silent. Something had been seen, not by them, but by me. And I knew, even as the music faded behind me, that this erasure would not be the final word. The morning after the wedding was quiet, almost suspiciously so. The house didn't feel like mine, not in the way it once had. There were no dishes to wash, no pans cooling on the stove, no scraps of frosting drying on the counter. The kitchen was still too clean, like something out of a catalog. I sat alone at the table with a lukewarm cup of tea and stared at the patch of light crawling across the floor. I didn't move. I didn't have anywhere to be. No one was waiting for my food or my presence. I was surplus, a leftover from a generation that no longer mattered. I had spent the previous evening sorting through emotions I didn't know how to name. There was no single word that captured it. It wasn't just sadness or humiliation. It wasn't pure anger either. It was quieter than that, heavier, like standing in front of a locked door that used to open with ease. I felt the weight of things unspoken, the ache of being replaced, or maybe simply forgotten. I opened a kitchen drawer and pulled out an old cloth-bound notebook. The pages smelled like spice and ink and time. I flipped through them slowly, my fingers trailing over the handwritten notes and oil stains, memories baked into the margins. My mother's handwriting appeared in the early pages. My own took over somewhere around the middle. Some entries were detailed, others just sketches. A list of ingredients, a note about oven temperature, a comment on what to serve it with. I lingered over one entry labeled Sunday Stew, extra for Daniel. My chest tightened. That stew had been his favorite in college. I used to pack it in mason jars for him to take back to campus. He never returned the jars. I stood and walked over to the pantry. It wasn't a conscious decision. My body moved without instruction. My hands opened the doors, scanned the shelves, touched the glass jars lined up in rows. Lentils, barley, dried mushrooms, flour, sugar, spices. My kitchen had never been trendy, but it had always been ready. I ran my hand across the edge of the shelf like I was greeting an old friend. Something inside me stirred. Not quite clarity, not yet, but a whisper, a fragile thread of something waiting to be pulled. Later that afternoon, I went out to the backyard and sat beneath the magnolia tree. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and fading blossoms. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of home. I thought about the wedding, about the way everyone had looked right through me. I thought about the food they had eaten, how carefully curated it had been, how beautiful and hollow. I wondered how many of them had actually felt full. That question returned to me again and again over the following days. Did they feel full? Did they remember the taste of anything they'd eaten? Would it linger, or would it vanish like perfume in the wind? One morning, I walked into town and visited the community center. It was a modest brick building near the old post office, with faded flyers taped to the windows and a bulletin board covered in curling announcements. I asked about renting the small event room in the back, the one with the outdated linoleum floors and the scratched-up folding tables. The woman at the desk handed me a calendar. There were plenty of openings. I booked a Thursday evening 2 weeks out. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table and made a list, not of guests, but of dishes, the kind of dishes no one made anymore. Cornbread baked in cast iron, chicken and dumplings with hand-rolled dough, green beans stewed with onions and a dash of cider vinegar, peach cobbler with a biscuit crust. I wasn't planning a dinner party. I wasn't trying to impress. I just wanted to see what would happen if people tasted something real again. I spent the next few days sorting through boxes in the attic, looking for my mother's old serving dishes, the cream-colored plates with tiny cracks in the glaze, the blue enamel pot she used every Sunday. I brought them down, washed them by hand, lined them up along the counter like artifacts. I didn't rush. Each piece had a weight, a story. I let them speak. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my neighbors, not the ladies at church, not even the one friend who still called once a week to check in. This wasn't about marketing or announcements. It wasn't about revenge or reclaiming pride. It was about something smaller, quieter. The simple act of putting food on a table and letting it speak for itself. I made handwritten recipe cards for each dish, just in case someone asked. I didn't decorate them or try to make them look quaint. They were utilitarian, straightforward and honest, like the food. I tucked them into a small wooden box that had belonged to my grandmother. In the evenings, I sat on the porch and watched the light fade across the yard. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like space to think, to imagine, to rebuild. There was a thread now, running through me, connecting the woman I had been with the one I was becoming. A fragile thread, yes, but it was mine to follow. And I wasn't going to let it break. The week leading up to the event moved in a way that felt both slow and steady, like a pot simmering on the stove, never quite boiling over, but always warm. There was no frenzy, no rushing, no last-minute panic. I planned everything the way I had always done, methodically, quietly, with the precision of someone who had measured ingredients by feel for decades. But this time, something was different. There was a purpose in each movement, a quiet determination that hummed beneath my skin like an old melody I hadn't heard in years. I began with the cornbread. It had always been my signature, not because it was the fanciest thing I made, but because it was dependable. I pulled out the cast iron skillet that had belonged to my mother and placed it on the counter. It was blackened and smooth from years of use, its surface seasoned by time and fire. I sifted the cornmeal, mixed it with buttermilk, eggs, a touch of honey, and poured it into the hot, greased pan. The sizzle it made as it hit the surface was a sound I had missed. When it came out of the oven, the top was golden and cracked just right, the edges crisp, the center soft and warm. I wrapped it in a clean cotton towel and set it aside like a gift waiting to be opened. Next came the chicken and dumplings. I chose the older hen I'd been saving in the freezer, the kind that required long, slow cooking to tenderize. I boiled her with bay leaves, peppercorns, onion halves, and celery, skimming the broth as it rose. The scent filled the house in waves, thick with memory. I shredded the meat by hand, careful not to miss a bone, and rolled out the dough for the dumplings on the same countertop I'd used for over 40 years. Each dumpling was cut by eye, not with a cutter, and dropped gently into the bubbling broth one by one. I stood there watching them swell and dance in the steam, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled without effort. I moved on to the stewed green beans. I trimmed each one by hand, snapping the ends like I had with my grandmother on long summer afternoons. I cooked them low and slow with chopped onion, garlic, a ham hock, and just a splash of apple cider vinegar. They turned soft, tangy, and rich with flavor that no flash-fried side dish could replicate. I ladled them into an old ceramic serving bowl with a hairline crack running through the side. It had never failed me. The peach cobbler was last. I used frozen peaches from last year's harvest, sliced thick and coated in brown sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice. The topping was a drop biscuit dough, buttery and rough-edged, golden once baked. It bubbled and hissed in the oven, the scent so strong it made me dizzy for a moment. I let it cool on the windowsill, just like I used to when my son was young and the neighborhood children would pretend not to smell it as they played nearby. Throughout the week, I worked in silence. No music, no television, just the rhythm of chopping, mixing, baking, stirring. My hands knew what to do, even when my heart wavered. I didn't question my choices. I didn't second-guess the simplicity of the menu. These were the dishes that had carried generations. They didn't need reinvention. They needed only to be seen. I packed each dish with care, no plastic. I used real serving platters, linen napkins, and handwritten labels on small tent cards. Cornbread with local honey, stewed green beans with smoked ham, chicken and dumplings, slow cooked. I didn't embellish or add clever names. The food spoke for itself. It always had. At the community center, the room looked exactly as I remembered. Dim lighting, folding chairs, tables that wobbled slightly if you leaned too hard. It wasn't beautiful, but it was familiar. I arrived early and set everything up myself. There were no floral arrangements, no expensive cutlery, no themed decorations, just food, carefully prepared, laid out like an offering. I lit a few candles, not the scented kind, just plain white ones in glass jars, and placed them down the center of the tables. They flickered gently, casting a warm glow that softened the harsh overhead lights. I opened the windows slightly to let in the evening breeze. The air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and chicken broth, a strange but comforting combination. I didn't know who would show up. I hadn't sent out invitations. I had only told a handful of people, spoken in passing to a few familiar faces at the farmer's market, dropped a note in the mailbox of the church secretary. I didn't want a crowd. I wanted the right kind of presence, the kind that came hungry, not just for food, but for something more essential. As the sun began to set, shadows stretched across the floor, and my hands trembled slightly with anticipation. I looked at the table I had set, the food I had made, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not nervousness, not pride, something closer to readiness. I stood by the door as the first footsteps approached, but I wasn't looking for recognition. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I had already done the seeing. I had already remembered who I was, and now I was simply serving, as I always had, but this time on my own terms, in my own light. By the time the first guests arrived, the room had settled into a quiet hum of warmth. The candles burned low and steady, their wax beginning to pool at the bases of the jars. The smell of chicken and dumplings had permeated every corner of the small hall, clinging to the curtains, mixing with the scent of cornbread and stewed greens. I stood behind the table with my hands folded in front of me, not as a hostess, not as a chef, but simply as a woman who had cooked a meal and waited to see if anyone would care. The door creaked open slowly. A man stepped in, then another. I recognized them vaguely. Local businessmen, one of whom I remembered from church council meetings years ago. They looked around, uncertain, as if they had walked into a memory rather than an event. One of them removed his hat, nodded, and walked toward the table. I gave a small smile and gestured to the plates. No one needed instruction. They knew what to do. More people followed. A retired teacher I hadn't seen since my son's high school days. A woman from the bank now walking with a cane. A couple of younger men in clean dress shirts and expensive shoes. Strangers, but polite. One of them carried a briefcase. I watched them circle the food like it was a museum exhibit, cautious but curious. They filled their plates, slowly at first. A scoop of cornbread, a small serving of beans, just a taste of the chicken stew. Then they returned for more. I watched the way they ate, not for performance or pictures, but for satisfaction. Their bodies relaxed, their expressions softened. The way they chewed told me everything. They weren't just hungry. They were receiving something they didn't know they'd been missing. No one asked where the food had come from at first. They just ate. They passed dishes between each other. They murmured polite sounds of approval. And slowly, the room filled with something I hadn't heard in weeks: conversation. Not loud, not forced, but natural. People talked about the weather, about work, about grandchildren, about the taste of the green beans and the sweetness of the peach cobbler. They asked questions, made comparisons, shared memories triggered by flavor. I moved quietly among them, refilling platters, replacing utensils, clearing empty plates. No apron, no name tag. Just me. My presence wasn't announced, but it was felt. Not one person looked at me like I didn't belong. At one point, the man with the briefcase stood and walked over to the table. He had eaten 2 full servings and lingered over every bite. He placed his napkin beside his plate and looked at the small card next to the chicken and dumplings. His fingers traced the edge of the paper like he was reading a poem. He turned to me and asked a simple question: "Who made this?" I told him I did. Nothing more. He didn't blink. He nodded, introduced himself with a soft voice, and reached into his pocket. A business card appeared, embossed with gold lettering and a name I didn't recognize. He said he worked in investment, mostly small brands, locally sourced, traditional food projects that told stories through taste. He didn't ask for a pitch. He didn't offer a deal. He just said that what I had done was rare, and that if I ever wanted to expand, I should call. I took the card without expectation. I tucked it into the pocket of my cardigan and nodded. That was all. The evening continued without a single toast, without a playlist, without curated lighting or expensive flowers. No one posted photos. No one bragged. People simply ate, talked, and stayed. The room felt full, but never crowded. The clatter of forks and plates was rhythmic, comforting. The smell of peach cobbler and nutmeg thickened as the night went on, wrapping everyone in a kind of edible nostalgia. I didn't stand to give a speech. I didn't explain myself or tell the story of how I came to cook that night. I didn't need to. Every bite of food carried its own meaning. Every spoonful told the truth, and the truth didn't need embellishment. As the final guests began to leave, they came to shake my hand. One by one, they thanked me, not with flattery, but with the kind of gratitude that sticks to the ribs. They said things like, "I haven't tasted something like that in years," and "My mother used to make greens like this," and "You reminded me of home." I nodded, smiled, accepted their thanks. My hands were warm from washing dishes. My feet ached in my shoes, but I felt more grounded than I had in a long time. When the room was empty again, I sat down for the first time that night. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, lukewarm now, and looked around. The platters were scraped clean. The tablecloths were stained with joy. A few crumbs clung stubbornly to the edges of the plates. I didn't rush to clean. I let the silence settle again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of what had happened, of what I had made, of who I was when no one was looking. That evening hadn't been on any calendar. It wasn't part of a celebration or a grand reopening. It wasn't something I asked for, but it had arrived anyway, quiet, humble, and real. And I had met it not with applause, but with a ladle and a steady hand. And it was enough. That night, after the last chair had been pushed in and the final light had been switched off, I drove home in a kind of silence I hadn't known in years. Not the hollow kind, not the silence of absence or loneliness, but something else entirely, something heavier and warmer, a silence that held weight and meaning, like the last note of a song you didn't realize you'd needed to hear. My hands rested on the steering wheel without gripping it. My shoulders, so often hunched without my noticing, had fallen into a rare, relaxed posture, The night air moved gently through the open window, carrying with it the fading scent of cinnamon and stewed greens that had followed me like perfume. When I walked through the front door, the house felt different. It wasn't that anything had changed physically. The same framed photographs lined the hallway, the same coat hung by the door, the same stack of unopened mail sat on the kitchen counter. But something in the air had shifted. It felt like the walls were breathing easier, like the rooms no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I placed my keys on the table, turned on a lamp, and stood there for a moment, just listening to the hum of stillness. I moved slowly through the house, shedding the layers of the day, my shoes, my cardigan, the quiet tension I had worn like armor. My feet sank into the familiar softness of the hallway rug, worn down in the center where I had walked the same path countless times. I changed into an old cotton nightgown, one that had long since lost its shape but still carried the faint smell of lavender from the drawer. I washed my face, not out of routine, but because it felt good to touch my skin, to care for it gently. In the bedroom, I didn't turn on the overhead light. I let the glow from the hallway lamp spill softly across the room, painting the furniture in golds and shadows. I pulled back the quilt, hand-stitched, faded in places, but warm with years of use, and climbed into bed without checking my phone, without turning on the TV, without thinking about tomorrow. As I lay there, my body sinking into the mattress, a deep, unfamiliar calm settled into my bones. I didn't feel the usual ache behind my eyes. There was no loop of thoughts circling my mind, no quiet resentment waiting to be unpacked. My breathing slowed. My limbs grew heavier. The silence wasn't pressing in on me. It was holding me, gently, like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, I didn't replay conversations. I didn't second-guess my choices. I didn't wonder what someone else might have thought, or whether I had been too much or too little. I didn't think of the wedding. I didn't think of what I hadn't been given. I thought only of the smell of fresh bread as it leaves the oven, of the soft hum of people eating together, of the look on a stranger's face when a bite of food brings back a forgotten memory. Sleep came gradually, not as an escape, but as a welcome guest. My mind drifted through images I couldn't hold on to, flashes of flour-dusted countertops, the flicker of candlelight on a bowl of peach cobbler, the curve of a handwritten recipe card curled slightly at the corner. These weren't dreams. They were remnants, trailing pieces of something real that had rooted itself in the rhythm of my body. I didn't hear the wind outside. I didn't stir when the ice machine in the freezer clattered. I slept as though I had been released from something, as though the day had folded itself up neatly and placed itself on a high shelf where it couldn't reach me anymore. It was the kind of sleep that didn't erase tiredness, but rewrote it, turned it from depletion into something gentler, more forgiving. I didn't wake with a jolt, or to an alarm, or from a nightmare. I rose slowly, hours later, with the sun peeking gently through the curtains, and a strange sensation filling my chest. I didn't recognize it at first. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was steadiness. It was the feeling of having taken up space in the world and no longer apologizing for it. In the quiet dawn, wrapped in warmth and the fading softness of sleep, I knew something essential had shifted. I had fed people. I had given something of myself. And in return, I had received the most unexpected gift of all. Not applause or attention, not money or praise, but rest. Not just the kind that happens in the body, the kind that happens in the soul. And I wasn't going to forget that feeling. Not ever. After the event, I didn't rush into anything. The card from the investor stayed tucked in the drawer by my kitchen window, next to old birthday cards and unused coupons I kept forgetting to throw away. I didn't call. I didn't plan a grand opening. I didn't contact newspapers or talk to anyone about business licenses or food truck permits. I didn't start sketching out logos or pricing menus. That wasn't what this was about. It had never been about making something big. It was about making something honest. In the quiet days that followed, I kept cooking, not for guests, not for profit, just because my hands still needed to move that way. My body still answered to the rhythm of the kitchen. I made extra. I always did, and the extra didn't go to waste. I left small paper-wrapped parcels on neighbors' porches. I slid containers of soup into the mailbox at the community church. I dropped off a loaf of cornbread at the library, where the night shift clerk sat alone until sunrise. I didn't leave notes. I didn't want credit. I just wanted the food to find its way. I started keeping a list of requests. Nothing official. Just a spiral notebook with names and scribbles and short phrases like those apple hand pies or the sweet potato thing with nutmeg. People had begun to ask quietly, gently, if I might have some extra of whatever I was making next time. They spoke with the kind of reverence I hadn't expected, like they were asking not for food, but for a moment to return. I didn't need a cafe to do what I had always done. I had a stove. I had a mixing bowl older than some of the people I was feeding. I had 2 strong hands and a recipe book with a cracked spine and pages that smelled like butter and smoke. I had memory and patience and time. Word spread in the way real things often do, slowly, steadily, without fanfare. I began receiving small envelopes in the mail with cash folded between handwritten notes. For the bread, for the stew, thank you for reminding me of my grandmother. I didn't set prices. People gave what they could, sometimes more, sometimes nothing. It never mattered. One afternoon, a man I barely knew knocked on my door with a small bouquet of wildflowers. He said his wife hadn't eaten a full meal since her chemotherapy began, but she'd finished every bite of the chicken and rice I'd left on their porch. He called it a miracle. I just nodded and smiled and thanked him. I didn't tell him that I had added a few sprigs of thyme from my garden because I'd remembered she liked it that way. That summer, I cooked through heat waves and thunderstorms, through long afternoons where the light poured into the kitchen like syrup. My days were filled with chopping and baking and tasting, and though I didn't have customers lining up out front, I never once felt alone. I had created something that didn't need walls. I had built a kind of community that didn't rely on signage or opening hours. There were offers. The man with the briefcase followed up, first with a polite letter, then with a call I didn't return. He left a voicemail praising the quality of my food, explaining that there was an opportunity for real scale and that this could be something national. I listened to the message once and then deleted it. I didn't want national. I didn't even want regional. I wanted to stay where my feet already stood. Once, someone asked why I hadn't opened a storefront. They said I was missing a chance to leave a legacy, to make it. I almost laughed. Legacy isn't in the size of the thing you build. It's in the hands you feed, the comfort you leave behind. It's in the way someone remembers the taste of their childhood after one bite of stew. I didn't need a storefront to matter. I kept a small schedule. Mondays were for baking, Wednesdays for soups, Fridays for pies and cobblers. The rest of the days filled themselves in with small surprises, whatever the season brought, whatever my hands felt like making. I let the ingredients guide me. If the peaches were ripe, there'd be something sweet. If the tomatoes were heavy on the vine, I'd stew them down with basil and garlic until the kitchen smelled like August. Sometimes I sat on the porch in the evening and watched as people came by to pick up their orders. Always modest, always grateful. They left with brown bags and Tupperware and quiet smiles. They didn't stay to chat long. They didn't need to. The exchange had already happened in the food. I didn't hang a sign. I didn't give it a name. People called it Margaret's Kitchen, even though it wasn't open, even though there were no hours. It was just me, Just the house I'd lived in for more than 40 years, the kitchen that had held my life in grief and joy, and the stove that had never failed me. And so I didn't open a cafe. I opened something better. Something you couldn't put on a map or list on a website. Something that lived in the folds of a biscuit and the crust of a cobbler. Something that reached people without ever needing to raise its voice. Something small. Something real. Something mine. It happened gradually. There was no ribbon cutting, no sudden announcement, no glossy photo in the paper. One day, I was simply baking for myself, and the next, I was taking requests on a legal pad that sat by the landline. The names changed from week to week, but the notes they left sounded the same: grateful, nostalgic, quietly reverent. People started slipping envelopes into my mailbox with exact amounts of cash tucked inside, sometimes with a note, sometimes not. I didn't advertise. I didn't need to. The business, if you could call it that, grew without a storefront, without a sign, without a social media page or a fancy logo. There was no brand strategy, just food and memory, passed from hand to hand. Word spread across fences, at church pews, in hushed conversations at the grocery store. My name became a kind of secret among people who still believed in comfort and flavor and slow afternoons in warm kitchens. I didn't encourage it. I just didn't stop it. I filed the paperwork quietly one afternoon when the house was still. The notary came to the kitchen table. She stamped the documents with a practiced hand while sipping sweet tea from a mason jar. I chose a name because the form required one: Margaret's Table. It felt simple, old-fashioned, and right. I didn't print business cards. I didn't buy packaging. I folded everything in brown paper or tucked it into recycled glass jars and sealed it with masking tape. The only thing I ever labeled was the day it was made. I kept my records in a shoebox under the sink. Income, expenses, grocery lists. Nothing extravagant. I didn't need a credit line or a loan. I bought what I could afford, made what I could carry, and never promised more than I could deliver. People respected that. There was no expectation of speed. Orders came in when they came, and I made what I could with what the week offered. If I ran out of peaches, there would be apple crumble instead. If I had too many zucchinis, they'd show up in every other dish until the last one had been used. I took to writing small notes on slips of paper and slipping them into boxes. Nothing fancy, just a line or two. This stew is best with a piece of crusty bread, or warm gently and eat slowly. People started saving them. I saw one taped to a neighbor's fridge when I delivered a pie. Another had been pinned to a corkboard at the community center. I hadn't meant to start a tradition, but it happened anyway. Soon, I began hearing that my food had shown up in unexpected places. A woman told me she brought my peach cobbler to her father's hospice room, and he cried after the first bite. A man said he'd served my cornbread at his daughter's engagement dinner, and people asked which bakery it came from. I never corrected them. I just nodded and said, "Thank you." Once a month, I let myself read through the notes in the box. The letters, the comments, the scribbled receipts with extra cash folded inside. They reminded me that I had created something, even if it didn't have a door or a countertop or a closed sign. I had built something that fed people's hunger, not just in their bellies, but somewhere deeper. I had made space in their lives for pause, for remembrance, for joy. I didn't want more. That's what people didn't always understand. I didn't want to scale up or expand or franchise. I didn't want to turn my kitchen into an assembly line. I wanted to stir my own pots and knead my own dough. I wanted to pick herbs from my garden and wipe flour from my face with the corner of my apron. I wanted to know that the hands shaping the biscuits were mine, that the scent of vanilla and cinnamon came from my stove, not an industrial oven. The simplicity of it all held me in place. I didn't need a storefront to feel seen. I didn't need a window for people to know I was here. The food carried my name, even when it didn't say so out loud. It moved through the town like a hush, like a secret worth keeping. Not everyone knew about it, but those who did never forgot. There was a kind of peace in that, a quiet, firm peace that settled into the walls of my house and the folds of my apron. I moved slower now, more intentionally. I took breaks between batches, listened to the birds outside the window, and let myself rest when I needed to. I had nothing to prove. I had already done what I set out to do, even if I hadn't known it at the time. I didn't chase success. I didn't seek out recognition. But somehow, in the simple act of cooking, I had stumbled into something meaningful. A business without a window, a shop without shelves, a name people spoke in kitchens and whispered across tables, and that, to me, was more than enough. The invitation came in a thick cream envelope, hand-addressed, with a floral wax seal pressed into the back flap. It was elegant and deliberate, the kind of envelope that felt heavy even before you opened it. Inside was a card with calligraphy so fine it looked printed, inviting me to a formal reception celebrating the expansion of a new culinary venture, a partnership between a local investor and a boutique hospitality group launching a new line of upscale dining experiences. I recognized the name of the man who had given me his card that night at the community center. I didn't recognize the company name beneath it. I read the invitation once and placed it on the kitchen table beside the salt shaker. I didn't RSVP right away. I wasn't sure what answer felt right. It wasn't my event. It wasn't my food. It wasn't even my story anymore. But something about the neatness of the lettering, the way it was addressed just to me, not to the Delaney household or current resident, made me pause. Someone had thought of me. Someone wanted me there. The reception was held at an estate just outside of town, one of those renovated barns that looked nothing like a barn anymore. It had been restored into something glossy and spacious, with a gravel drive lined with fairy lights and valet parking attendants in black ties. I arrived alone, wearing the same soft blue dress I had worn to the wedding, though this time I paired it with a wool shawl and a pair of sensible shoes. I didn't style my hair. I didn't wear pearls. I didn't try to impress anyone. I went as myself. Inside, the space had been transformed. Tables were draped in linen, candles flickered in hurricane glass holders, and servers moved silently between guests with trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. I scanned the room and saw familiar faces, not family, but townspeople. People who knew my name, who had eaten my food, who had written thank you notes in crooked handwriting on yellow-lined paper. Some smiled when they saw me. Some nodded. I felt no obligation to move toward them. I simply observed. There was a long table near the center of the room, dressed in ivory and gold. On it sat an arrangement of small plates, each carefully labeled: cornbread with clover honey butter, stewed green beans with smoked pork shoulder, roasted chicken with thyme dumplings, and a warm peach cobbler in cast iron. I stared at the names and recognized every dish. Not approximations, not reimagined versions. The real ones, the ones from my notebook, the ones from my hands. A printed menu lay nearby, with the heading, Inspired by Heritage. Beneath it, in smaller font, was a single line, with gratitude to the community and the home cooks who keep tradition alive. There was no name, no direct mention of me. But I didn't need it. Guests walked from table to table with their plates, praising the richness of the stew, the crisp edge of the cornbread, the way the peach filling wasn't too sweet. I heard fragments of conversation about how the food reminded them of childhood, about how nobody cooks like this anymore, about how it tasted like Sunday at Grandma's. They didn't know they were quoting my own memories back to me. I took a seat near the back of the room at a small table, meant for overflow guests or late arrivals. The linen was slightly wrinkled, the candle half burned. I liked it there. It gave me a view of everything without being seen. I ate slowly, savoring the familiar taste, not because it was better than what I had made, but because it carried the weight of distance. It was mine, and not mine, at the same time. At one point, I saw my son across the room. He stood next to a table of sharply dressed people, laughing, a glass of champagne in one hand. He looked older, more polished than I remembered, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't come over. I felt no sting, no ache, just a kind of distant acceptance. He had chosen his life. I had chosen mine. As the evening wore on, a small girl in a velvet dress wandered over to my table. She had a plate in her hands with a single slice of peach cobbler and a crooked grin. She sat down without asking and took a bite, then another, then looked at me with wide eyes. "Did you make this?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost reverent. I smiled but said nothing. She didn't need the answer. She knew. She finished the cobbler, thanked me, and ran off before I could speak. I sat in the candlelight with the empty plate in front of me and felt something settle deep in my chest, something final, but not sad. I didn't need a speech or applause or a plaque with my name on it. The food had traveled. The memory had lived. And someone, somewhere, would carry that taste forward. When I left, no one stopped me. I walked to my car in the cool evening air, the gravel crunching under my shoes, the lights fading behind me like stars blinking out one by one. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and sat there for a moment, watching my breath fog the glass. I thought of all the meals I had made, all the hands that had held my food, all the quiet moments of nourishment I had given without ever asking for anything in return. This hadn't been my wedding. This hadn't been my celebration. But it had still been mine, in the way that mattered most, in the way that couldn't be taken, in the way that lasts.